Greetings, this video is a reproduction of my 2015 talk at SharkNet Research Day entitled Boundary Tension Between Coexisting Phases of a Block Copolymer Blend. The work was done with Mark Matson and relevant links are in the description. Block copolymers are polymers made of two different types of monomers separated into different regions or blocks. You can imagine taking, say, a polyisoprene molecule and a polystyrene molecule and covalently bonding them together end to end, resulting in something like the polymer shown here. For the purposes of this talk, it doesn't matter if I'm talking about polystyrene block polyisoprene or some other copolymer, so I'll just call one type of monomer A-type and label it red, and the other B-type and label it blue. Polymers are often a lot longer than the short strings of monomers that I've shown here. You can think of them as long, wiggly things. Mathematically, the polymers in the theory that I'm going to talk about today are fully flexible strings. There's an effective repulsion between different types of monomers. You can think of it kind of like oil and water. They don't like to mix together. But unlike oil and water, the monomers in copolymers are bonded together so they can't completely separate, that is, macrophase segregate. Instead, they microphase segregate, that is, they form these small periodic structures on nanometer length scales. Which structures form depends on the relative size of the blocks. When the blocks are of equal size, they form layers. When they're of different sizes, the smaller block tends to form a small domain embedded in a matrix of the bigger block. If there's a little difference in the size, they can form cylinders. If the minority block is much smaller, they tend to form spheres. The method that I use to understand polymer behavior is self-consistent field theory. The first step is to represent all polymer-polymer interactions by a field. To make an analogy, it's kind of like how if you have a bunch of charged particles, you can think of the particle interacting individually with every other particle, or you can think of it feeling an electric field. In this case, I define a field that monomers feel, and this field is a function of position and represents all interactions with all other monomers. I start with a field that's a guess to what the monomers will feel. I then consider a polymer in the field and calculate how it will behave. That is, I calculate the probability distribution of monomers in that polymer. Now, if there are a lot of polymers in the system that are essentially the same, this probability distribution should reflect the average behavior of these polymers. So from the field, I can calculate the concentration. But the field represents interactions that a monomer has with all other monomers, so from the concentration I can then calculate the field. This allows me to update the field iteratively until I get a self-consistent solution. This procedure, self-consistent field theory, has been wildly successful in describing polymer behavior. This is the phase diagram for diblock copolymers. On the left, calculated with self-consistent field theory, and on the right, seen in experiments. The vertical axis is the Flory-Huggins interaction parameter chi-n. It's a measure of the strength of the repulsion between A and B blocks. You can think of it like inverse temperature, so high chi-n is low temperature and low chi-n is high temperature. The horizontal axis, F, is the fraction of the copolymer that's A-type, and goes from 0, which is pure B-type, to 1, pure A-type. At high temperatures, the blocks mix together, forming the disordered phase. When the temperature is reduced, you start to get those microphase segregated structures I described earlier. Theoretical predictions and experiments agree very well at high chi-n, that is low temperature, and they agree pretty well at lower chi-n, but they start to disagree near the order-to-disorder transition. There's been a lot of work done on this, but it's not the focus of this talk. This talk focuses on symmetric copolymers at high chi-n, where self-consistent field theory does very well. To start with, let's go back to that simple lamellar phase formed by symmetric diblock copolymers. At this point, we're going to add some short copolymers to the melt. The A blocks of the short copolymers stick with the A blocks of the long copolymers, and their B blocks stick with the other B blocks. This results in them going to the AB interface, as shown here. This isn't the only scenario that can take place. It turns out that long and short copolymers don't like to mix together. Copolymers in this scenario end up stretching in ways that are not favorable. They do, however, have another option. Just like how oil and water can macrophase segregate, the long and short copolymers can also segregate into regions that are rich in long copolymers and form large lamellae, and regions that are rich in short copolymers and form short lamellae. This picture shows phase separation of long and short copolymers occurring in an experiment. We can also use self-consistent field theory to understand this macrophase segregation. This is an equilibrium phase diagram in terms of the ratio of polymer lengths on the vertical axis, and the fraction of the system that's composed of short polymers on the horizontal axis. At the top, we see that when the lengths are not too different, they mix together like in the scenario above, forming a single lamellar phase, like in the example I showed. As the short copolymers get down to about 20% of the length of the long ones, they start to phase segregate. This phase diagram shows that if you start with a mixture of about 30% long copolymers and about 70% short copolymers, where the short copolymers are about 16% as long as the long ones, it'll phase segregate into a region of long lamellae that's about 45% short copolymer, and a region of short lamellae that's about 90% short copolymer. If we move down a little, we see that if the short copolymers are shorter, about 8% the length of the long ones, they separate more strongly into a region of long lamellae that's about 25% short copolymer, and another region of short lamellae that's almost pure short copolymer. When the short copolymers get short enough, they start to disorder, and there's coexistence between long lamellae and disordered short copolymers. At the bottom, we see that when the short polymers get very short, the system doesn't phase segregate, but simply forms either the lamellar phase, or if it's almost pure short polymer, they just mix together and form the disordered phase. So now we have a system of long lamellae and a system of short lamellae. Although they form in different regions of the experiment, these regions have to intersect somehow. So the question is how to put them together. The simplest thing to do is to just stick them together like this. This is the behavior predicted by strong stretching theory. There's no added AB overlap, so no enthalpic penalty, and there's no stretching of polymers, so no entropic penalty. It's the obvious thing to do. In experiments, we see a whole lot of ways that long and short lamellae can intersect. Conspicuously absent, however, is a simple scenario that we just described. The most common type of interface that's seen is this one, where the long and short lamellae meet at an angle. But why? Why is this scenario preferred over the simple one? Now we have a mystery, two candidate behaviors, and we want to understand them further. It's time to pull out the old self-consistent field theory and see what that has to say. We start by initializing the system in such a way that it will form long and short lamellae interfacing in the simple way. We then run the SCFT algorithm to obtain the self-consistent behavior. The graph shows the concentration of A monomers in the solid line, and the total concentration of short polymers in the dotted line as a function of position. The picture above also illustrates the A monomer concentration. On the left, there are long lamellae with short lamellae at the AB interface, while on the right there are short lamellae that are essentially pure short copolymer. Looking at the interface between the regions of long and short lamellae, it's not a perfectly sharp line, like if we just stuck the long and short lamellae together. This is clear from the slight increase in A monomer density to the right of the interface. But that little interfacial width doesn't look like much. How much effect could it really have? Later on, we'll calculate the interfacial tension, the cost of forming that interface, and see how much effect it has. But first, let's take a look at some even shorter polymers. When the short polymers become short enough to disorder, we see coexistence between lamellae and disorder. It's even more clear here that the interface is finite and has an effect on the adjacent phases. Even though the short polymers want to mix together forming the disordered phase, their A blocks tend to aggregate with the A-rich regions formed by the long polymers. And since the A and B blocks are stuck together, the A-rich layer causes a B-rich layer next to it, and so on. There's therefore a short region of AB modulations that quickly die out, giving way to the disordered phase. Our next step is to look at the other type of long-short interface that I'll call the kink boundary. It's run with reflecting boundary conditions in the horizontal direction and periodic boundary conditions in the vertical direction. The system has a preferred concentration for long and short lamellae. Given that there's a fixed number of long copolymers and a fixed number of short copolymers in the system, the ratio of the volumes of long and short lamellae are therefore fixed. There's also a preferred spacing for long and short lamellae. In this case, we can calculate the equilibrium spacing of the long lamellae and set the vertical dimension of the box to that. The short lamellae also have a preferred spacing that we can calculate. We don't know a priori how much copolymer goes to the interface or the interfacial width, meaning that we can't precisely calculate the relationship between the amount of copolymer in the system and the size of the domains, making it impossible to line up the long and short lamellae appropriately. When one doesn't know how much polymer to use, the usual thing to do is to use the grand canonical ensemble and let the system decide. However, if we do this, the system would simply convert into one containing only long or only short lamellae in order to get rid of the interface. We don't know how to set up the system to ensure that the short lamellar spacing and the interface are both at their equilibrium values. When the system is set up like this, however, the long lamellae can move, essentially winding the short lamellae around, allowing them to find their equilibrium spacing. To see what I mean, consider that this is not yet an equilibrium configuration. This is just the start of an SCFT calculation. When I let the calculation run, this is how the field changes. This is now the equilibrium state with the preferred spacings for both the long and short lamellae, their preferred interfacial structure, and their preferred long-short interfacial angle. The lamellar disorder boundary is a lot easier to deal with since the disordered phase has no preferred spacing. One interesting finding of this interface is these modulated regions in the disordered phase next to the interface. They look a lot like the modulated regions that we saw for the other interface type, and they form for similar reasons. If we simply take a look at the interface that we found and compare it with the one in experiments, it looks pretty close. We even see the same angle and the same little wiggles in the short lamellae next to the interface. It's not surprising that the angle is close. If you go back to slide 12, or look at the paper linked in the description, and look at the geometrical setup, the angle is given by the ratio of the lamellar spacings, which is given by the ratio of length, but still cool nonetheless. Finally, we get to the interfacial tension, which tells us how much it costs to form these interfaces. The details of how these calculations are done is beyond the scope of this talk, but if you're interested, see the paper linked in the description. We've plotted the interfacial tension as a function of the ratio of polymer lengths. The tensions go to 0 at a ratio of about 20%, where the system no longer phase segregates. But for most of the length ratios before this, the kink boundary has a lower tension, meaning that it's preferred, just as seen in experiments. In this talk, I've presented two possible structures for interfaces between long and short lamellae formed by phase segregated long and short copolymers. Strong stretching theory predicts this simple interfacial structure, while the other one, the kink boundary, is seen in experiments. The morphologies seen in SCFT are consistent with those seen in experiments, and the interfacial tension calculations from SCFT also predict the kink boundary. Once again, if you're interested, our paper is linked in the description. I hope you enjoyed this rendition of boundary tension between coexisting phases of a block copolymer blend. Thanks for listening.